So one of the interesting things that is happening across the world is how we see all of these debates that have to do with like revisiting the past, but revisiting the past not just for the sake of the past, but revisiting the past in terms of interrogating and especially questioning the present and questioning the present. So, certain inequalities, injustices, and so on can be corrected and with the aim of creating I suppose, a more representative, a more fair, a better future. If you think about it, I unfortunately I don't think this is quite the case of Jamaica. I don't think that we are there yet, for reasons that perhaps we will need a different webinar, right? But I think this is our context, and our context is one in which like that history and that continue an ongoing discussion between past and present, or present and past, and even future. It's not part of the kind of sort of regular debates and conversations on this island. So having that context in mind, I think we have to think a little bit about why that is the case, and in the meantime, how people who are practitioners, whether it is as researchers, as teachers, or public historians, and so on, how we can do a few things perhaps to try to correct these things. And I think that notion of decolonizing history could be useful, because perhaps it could contribute to create a different relationship between Jamaicans and history, between Jamaicans and their history. Right. One of the things that I have observed, I've been teaching at UWI since 2007. One of the things that I had seen is obviously what, as I refer to this detachment, right, or that decreasing interest in history. Part of it, I think, has to do with the detachment with the topics in the curriculum. People sometimes do not feel that connected to some of the topics that are taught in the curriculums, and especially at the in the high schools, especially at what we call the CSEC and the Cape levels, right? But the other thing, and it might be a little bit controversial, which is also what I will call the quote-unquote excessive focus on slavery. And I want to put it in inverted commas, because it's not excessive in the sense that, of course, slavery has been a significant development in terms of like shaping the modern history of this island and the people and modern Jamaicans, right? There's no question about it. But perhaps it's also the ways in which like the curriculum has engaged with the slavery, right? I think yes, the excessive focus on slavery sometimes has to do with trying to create this kind of common ties across, not just across the island of Jamaica, but also, and this is something that I will mention later on, across the region. And there's also has been that focus on slavery also because there are that element of resistance against an institution like this, that obviously it's one of the elements that the curriculum has focused on for reasons that we can understand. But one of the things that perhaps I have observed a little bit from the distance is that where this narrative of resistance may have been more, and I say from the distance because obviously what I'm going to say now, I think this narrative of resistance may have been more appealing in decades gone, in 60s and 70s, even 80s and so on. That narrative of resistance has become less and less appealing or attractive to the younger generations. But we can talk maybe about it later on. All right, so what do I think we have to think about it is like we need to consider the role of history and why the decolonizing history is important, and why we are where we are right now. So the role of history, obviously we can see the role of history in education in terms of the values that it has, in terms of like obviously the development of understanding of different cultures, the development of different skills, analytical skills, and so on. So history has value in terms of education, and we all understand that role. But also we know that history has value in other aspects that have less to do with education, and sometimes also we have less control over. History has also a role in terms of nation building. In the case of Jamaica, and perhaps has been more in the case of regional building, but we will speak about it shortly. So we see that role of history as a tool for the, as an educational tool, but it's also seen as a tool for nation building. And this is something that I think our Jamaican leaders understood, and Jamaican and Caribbean historians understood, like from early on. So we see that role there, and perhaps then. I will link this idea of nation regional building to perhaps what I see as the absence of Africa in the curriculum. And there's another role of history which has more to do, perhaps, if you think with this idea of shaping identities, whether it is group identities or individual identities. I think as individuals, we all understand how, in many ways, our sense of self, it's in some ways, even sometimes unconscious ways, like it's informed by history, or how history is transmitted to us, or how we interact with history, and so on. So from that perspective, I think that if we think about decolonization of history, we have to think about those roles and who is in control of transmitting this history, particularly, as I said, to students in the high schools. As you well know, the interaction of most people in Jamaica with history happens at the school level, and this is why I'm focusing a little bit on this aspect of education and the ways in which history is transmitted from these particular perspectives of not just education but also nation building, and also maybe group identities and so on. Right. In all of this, as I said, I see the absence of Africa, and I think that's that is very prevalent. And I'm not so sure, and maybe the discussion will help me understand a little bit more the extent to which people are aware of this absence, and if anybody feels like this absence is particularly strange, considering that a significant part of a significant portion of Jamaican population, Jamaican citizens, are of African ancestry. Anyway, so the idea here, and one of the things that I want to say, is that yes, Africa history should be part of Jamaican's history, right? While the history of the modern Caribbean may have started in the late 15th century, in the late 1400s, that is not the case of modern Caribbean peoples. The history of modern Caribbean peoples started way before. In the case of a significant portion of the Jamaican population, this history, this African history, their history, started, of course, way before the arrival of Europeans in the Caribbean. It is for this reason that I think that if we're going to decolonize, history in history education, especially in Jamaica, one of the things is that we have to revisit the role or the presence, or sometimes lack of presence, of Africa and its history on the curriculums across the schools in Jamaica at different levels of the education system, right? So having said all this, let me just talk to you about this idea that I talk about, the syllabus in Jamaica, and the presence of or the lack of an African presence or African history presence in the curriculums in Jamaica, particularly at the CSEC and Cape history level, which is what I know a little bit more. One of the things that is, and this is once again, I'm not sure the extent to which people might find this a little bit odd or peculiar, but one of the things that is very particular about history in Jamaica, but not just in Jamaica, and not just history, I guess education in general, is the fact that what you have is usually curriculums that are heavily informed by some sort of regional agenda, right? So you have regional syllabus as opposed to national syllabus, right? And from the perspective of history, what we see is obviously that these regional syllabus the emphasis is fundamentally on the Caribbean region and Caribbean regional identity, right? And well, I don't want to speculate on the reasons for this focus on Caribbean regional identity, but and which obviously I'm not going to say no, it shouldn't be like this or anything like that. I'm not trying to make that case. But what I think I can make the point is that despite that focus on this kind of Caribbean regional identity, what I observe from my interaction with students, university students, but obviously who have gone through a secondary education level, my experience with them is that they feel detached from that sort of Caribbean experience. It's almost like it is something that is perhaps not as meaningful or as appealing as it might have been to past generations. But there's no question about it, and that is very clearly stated on the syllabus that is one of the main objectives of the syllabus at the Cape and CSEC level or CSEC and Cape level. I'm looking at I'm looking at the CSEC level here, and there's a list of items here on the aims, and the first two talk about the develop knowledge and understanding of the experiences of the peoples of the Caribbean, and the second one, develop an appreciation of the creative contributions of individuals and groups in their own territory and their own territories of the Caribbean. So that's very clear, but I think it becomes even more clear in the Cape history syllabus. The aim is develop an understanding of Caribbean world, of course, and develop, where is it? Assist students, here, number 3, assist students to view themselves as citizens of states and persons sharing a common Caribbean culture. So that I think speaks for itself, and it's very clear, I think, in the content and the design of the syllabus how that emphasis on the Caribbean for understandable reasons, right? It is very prominent or very prevalent. However, I think that in these curriculums or on this syllabus, one of the things that it's problematic is that absence of Africa. And in the CSEC syllabus, one of the things is history is the African history. The presence of African history is very marginal. Right, it's very marginal. If I'm looking at the themes, there are several things, right, that we see there, and it's only on one of the themes that deals with the economic revolutions and coming of the Africans. There's one topic that deals with overview of West African societies in the 15th century, economic, religious, and political organization. Of course, is the 15th century, which is sort of the preamble to the arrival of the Europeans in the Caribbean, and of course the developments that you all know about. So that presence is very marginal. When it comes to the Cape history, it's not much better. It's just like it's still also very marginal. Right, and mostly has to do, of course, with slave trade and slavery, and that's fundamentally the main emphasis. And even when it deals on when it focuses on Africa, it focuses on Africa from the perspective of the impact of the slave trade, right? So as if that is the main sort of like historical development that shaped West Africa or Central Africa in any way. So that is as much as we can say. There is, of course, in the Cape syllabus, you also see presence of Africa when it comes to the process of decolonization, more like sort of contemporary history, 20th century history, if you like, and then we see that presence in terms of decolonization, and then we see the appearance of cases like decolonization in Ghana, or of course the struggle for liberation in South Africa. But separate and apart of this, that presence of Africa, it's marginal, and I think that is a very sort of like considering the sort of like the history of Jamaica and the history of or the characteristics of Jamaican society, to me, it's somewhat surprising that Africa is no more it has no it doesn't have a greater presence, particularly when it comes to those issues that I spoke about before, which has to do with the development of identities and sense of self and so on. And I don't think I'm naive enough that I think there is something conscious. There's a conscious decision to sort of like minimize that presence of Africa and in the curriculums and not pay greater attention to that, right? And here's what I think what we could do a little bit different. I think we need to, as much as possible, I think we need to introduce Africa more in our conversations about history, and in terms of like the conversations that have to do not just with the past experiences, but also with the present experiences of Jamaican peoples. Right? Obviously, it seems to me that the connections with the African continent are obvious, but those connections started like way before, right? I think we need to sort of like avoid this kind of excessive connection to Africa as by way of slavery. I think that's part of, by the way, one of the things that I also observe is that there has been, to me, a decreasing interest in African history among students at the university level. And I think part of it's because Africa is so often associated to slavery, as if that's the only or the main historical development that shaped Africans' historical experiences. We need to bring to the fore the rich and diverse experiences of African peoples and how we can incorporate this. We need to find ways to incorporate this into our curriculums. And perhaps maybe the emphasis in how we teach history should not be so much based on physical space and territories, right? But history is about peoples, right? And if the history is about peoples and it's the experiences of peoples, the experiences of Jamaican people or peoples began in different places, but to a very large extent, that those experiences are sort of located on the African continent, on West and Central Africa in particular. And I think we're doing a disservice to our students when we don't incorporate those rich and diverse historical experiences of, especially if you prefer just West and Central Africa, incorporating those experiences more so into the curriculum, so students can learn much more about the challenges, the responses to those challenges, the kinds of transformations that took place, and so on. Provide a much more diverse, a much more nuanced picture of Africa's past, but also of their past. Because I think that's what we need to emphasize a little bit more, that African past is not just the past of Africans, but it's also the past of peoples in the diaspora, and that is a shared past. Slavery is just one aspect of African history, but not the most relevant, believe it or not, even though across the world, perhaps that's the emphasis has been so much on slavery. Clearly, this is not, I wouldn't say that has been the most relevant aspect of African history. Maybe when it comes to world history, perhaps, but definitely not when it comes to the experiences of African peoples themselves, right? The other thing that I think we need to do is like that connection with African history needs to be taught also during, as not just in terms of like what the connections between Jamaican peoples and African peoples were before the late 15th century, but also during the entire period of slavery. Those connections continue, right? I mean, those historical experiences, those historical developments that are taking place in the African continent, right, are happening at a time where people are still being transported to the Americas from West and Central Africa. So in that case, all of that history of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, it's also that part of Jamaican's history. And there's something very significant that we need to find is also that at some point in the 19th century, how can we teach our students to see how at some point in the 19th century, Jamaicans and peoples in the Caribbean and peoples in the diaspora in general started to look at Africa. It is almost in this process of reversing the sail that we're going to see how the diaspora is going to start to influence very significantly the history of the African continent. Why don't our students know more about these things, right? Why this is something that these are not conversations and discussions that we have with our students, and try to understand why at that particular time peoples in the diaspora, including in Jamaica, started to look at Africa, travel in some cases, and start to shape developments in the African continent. That's something that we need to, I think we need to bring to the fore. And finally, with regards to the presence of African history as Jamaican history, right? We need to understand that no matter what the absence of Africa in our national or regional curriculums, right? There is an emotional connection that we can avoid. And I think every student, no matter what, no matter how Africa is not, regardless of how absent Africa is, the Jamaican students know of this connection, and they feel this connection. And sometimes that connection has been neglected, has been maligned in some ways because of the ways that we have thought about it. And the final point that I want to make is about the present and the future. One of the things that I think perhaps has happened is that the connection between Africa and Jamaica, Africa and the Caribbean, Africa and the diaspora, in a way, became a bit less relevant since the end of colonization. With the end of colonization, nation states into the project or into the process of nation building. And in that way, those kinds of historical and ideological connections between the two sides of the world were sort of like overlooked somehow, right? But I think the present, we need to recover. We need to start looking at it in terms of the ties that we still share. There are obviously challenges that we share. And I think the current pandemic is one example of it, right? And I don't know, our ability or lack of ability to deal with the current crisis in many ways resembles more in the Caribbean to the experience of African people, to whatever it is that people in Britain or the United States or France might be going through, and so on. We have all the types of challenges that tie us together, and in which we need greater connections that can help us start discussions that address the particular challenges that we face, right? And well, I will just say that those connections those present connections and even future connections can be restored if we start looking at that relationship between Africa and Jamaica, African history and Jamaican history differently. If we try to incorporate them in creative ways, that do not become burdensome. And I'm saying this because the curriculums are already too heavy. But we need, and I don't have the solution, by the way. But how can we sort of perhaps reduce those curriculums and at the same time incorporate different aspects? And in this way, Africa could have a more central role in how Jamaicans are taught about their history. And this is it. Thank you.
Bernadette is sound very far away.
Is this better? Hello?
Yes.
Yes,
okay.
That's better.
Okay, great. So just reminding everyone that we're allowing our questions via the chat box. So far, Dr. Okenve, we have a few comments and another for some discussion. Melissa has made the comment that she agrees that there is an absence of meaningful African history at all levels of the Jamaican curriculum. Then Joan has pointed out that there is an hypocritical stance being taken about the decolonization process, in that there seems to be a biased approach to what is taken away and what is retained. For example, there was a recent Gleaner article of a Jamaican in Egypt recognizing fallen World War One soldiers. Where was this narrative in the history syllabus? Excuse me, such that 100 years later, the JDF is unaware of this military cemetery. Secondly, the Windrush generation was a Caribbean story which remained absent from our history syllabus. It was only a few years ago when the matter was publicized in the UK that it was then talked about locally. So this was coming from Joan. Would you like to comment, Dr. Okenve?
Yes, something came to my mind. I don't really have something very insightful to say, but something came to my mind as he said that is that I think, and this is funny because when people talk about history, oh yeah, it's the past, it's always the same. Well, it's always the same because it is true that there is excessive repetition in how history is taught in Jamaica from, I mean, not specifically as history. I think, I don't know if you call it social studies or whatever it is at the primary school level. I can't remember right now. Sorry. The title of the name of the subject will soon come to my mind. I should know this because my two children are doing these subjects. But there's excessive repetition. And people tend to think, oh, it's always the same and so on. And of course, we know that it is a way that history, that past, is not only way richer and diverse, but it's also something that is not set in stone. It is revisit. Historians and whether it is the professional or public level, they constantly revisit these things, and we don't do enough of this. But I think what I was thinking when John mentioned that, made that point, is that part of the problem that we have is that we don't have at the local level, we don't have enough historians. We don't have enough historians. When we don't have enough students doing history in high schools, when we don't have enough students doing history at the university level, it means that we are depleting the pool from which new historians can come up and investigate new topics and so on. And those new topics don't have to be academic topics. It can be like part of public history, it can be educational history and so on. But we don't have, I think if you compare to the level of production that we see in other parts of the world in terms of history, we have a shortage of labor, if you think about it.
So another comment. Thank you, Dr. Kenve. So this is a very important discussion. In high school, we learn of Songhai and Timbuktu, but what specific intervention would you suggest to make the CAPE syllabus, CSEC syllabus, more engaging in the approach to African history, given that the CAPE is a 2-year focus on Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa?
Okay, that's the question. That's the question I was afraid of. Like, okay, so what will we do differently, right? Well, there is that issue of the one thing that perhaps I will do is like not teaching these topics just as developments in Ghana, Nigeria, or South Africa, but also perhaps I think to make them more engaging is that the connections between that history and the history of Jamaica and the Caribbean. What I mean by this is that if you think about the whole liberation movement, there are clear connections in which like intellectuals, nationalists, and politicians, from both sides of across the Atlantic, they're influencing each other. And I think, for example, you cannot understand the development of anti-colonial resistance in Africa without the influence of the diaspora, the intellectual and ideological influence of the diaspora. Marcus Garvey, the presence of Marcus Garvey across much of English-speaking Africa, it's very prominent from relatively early on in the 20th century. That presence is going to influence different movements there. So I think. I think we need to look at history more in terms of like not just developments that happen in kind of isolation, but also in terms of disconnections. And I think the connections with us is what makes those histories more appealing and more relevant. And that's why I will perhaps that's one of the things that I will change.
Thank you. So Melissa has also added a bit more. She speaks to the issue of the general perception of history as being unimportant. The media has done much to tarnish the image of Africa, and there is not much of an identification with Africa amongst Caribbean and Jamaican people. The placement of Africa as other causes us not to want to identify with Africa. There is a distinct connection with economics in what is placed in the syllabus. So I don't want if you'd like to comment about that.
It's a media, but I think it's been a long history. It's been a long history of 200 plus years of creating these powerful images and powerful as enduring, I should say, more enduring images of Africa. And I think and this is the thing. I don't think we should learn about African history detached from other aspects that maybe have to do more with culture and so on. And I think that perhaps one of the things I think I mentioned, I can't remember. Well, I talked to many people, but I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said like, let's look at what we can oral orators. So we have all these oral traditions, oral histories like tales and stories and things like that, right? And Africa has obviously, and Jamaica as well, has a rich history of this, and there are those connections there. There is creativity. One of the things I will say, and this is something that I was talking to relatives about, I think part of the problem that also we have is that changes have to take place in the African continent. I don't think at the African continent levels, like at the different countries, we have paid enough attention to sort of like reflect much more on our cultures, our philosophies, and teach all of these things. And we hear about different of course European philosophies, Asian philosophies, and cultures and things like that. We don't have enough of that in Africa, and we haven't, mainly because of the resources and the limitations. We have not invested enough in analyzing, studying this, and sort of like making it available for people to learn. There's a lot that Africans need to learn themselves about their cultures, and it's not sufficiently taught. And of course, from that, if we create that could make it possible for people in the diaspora in Jamaica, in this case, to also benefit from this knowledge and these resources. So maybe that could help to sort of like change those images, right? Oftentimes or sometimes, those images were created about 200 years ago, and in different ways they still survive to date, and I think that is problematic. Whereas, for example, we have totally obviously there are people who still hang on to these sentiments, but we have, for the most part, rejected these notions of biological superiority of one group over the other. But the notion of cultural superiority, in a way, is still, obviously, it's not politically correct to say, but those notions are still there, and they're prevalent. In Africa, it still continues to be at the bottom of it, and in terms of how people perceive the value of African cultures. And that happens, by the way, as I said, also in the African continent. So obviously, it's not surprising that in Jamaica, also people will have this a strange relationship with Africa in that way as well.
Thank you. And another comment spoke to efforts to return to Africa, such as the Barbadians who moved to Liberia. Any comments there?
I wasn't. I saw the comment popping up, and I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't aware. I wasn't aware of it at all. I mean, I know about Liberia and African Americans in the 19th century. Maybe somebody can enlighten me about these Barbadians and when did that happen. But I mean, they have been. Perhaps the thing that we need to do as well, in this conversation, invites you to think on different ways, is that the other thing that has to happen is that if we need to teach more African history in Jamaica and in the Caribbean, and across the Americas, by the way, right? I think we also need to teach more of that history of the of the Africans in the diaspora in Africa. Sometimes when people return in inverse commas to Africa in this sort of way, right? Sometimes there is much of a disconnect because people in Africa also know very little about people in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and so on, beyond superficial things like reggae music and things like that. So I think African people also need to be taught more about the experience of Africans outside the African continent.
Thank you, Dr. Okenve. All right. If there are no other comments, thank you for that presentation. It's brought different ideas to mind, and just an overall reminder of the need for all the institutions involved in the preservation and promotion of Jamaican history to partner more so that we can get back the appreciation, beginning with the schools and the curriculum. Thank you so much, Dr. Okenve.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
All right.
So I'm now going to invite Staci-Marie Dehaney. I'm going to just quickly introduce her. So, former director of the Military History and Library Services and ex-captain with the Jamaica Defense Force with responsibilities for the management of military heritage, the Jamaican Military Museum and Library, and the Museum Newcastle Hill Station. As the former curator of the Jamaica Defense Force Museums, Ms. Dehaney was responsible for the development of exhibitions and programs about Jamaica's military history. She acted as the military's public liaison on military heritage matters and as a force curator to encourage and facilitate new research on Jamaican military history and its material culture. She has a degree in African history and political science, a master's in heritage studies from the UWI Mona, an MBA from Florida International University, certificate in paper conservation from the Malaysian Archives, Oxford Cultural Leaders Alumni, Oxford University and Chinese Culture and Economy, Nanshan University, China. With 17 years in the museums field, her experience includes director for the Museums of History and Ethnography, now National Museums of Jamaica, Institute of Jamaica. Her research interests include visual culture, with an emphasis on colonial photography and representation of the empire, and the commodity culture that evolved, British military collections with particular interest in the collecting practices during expansion campaigns and their interpretation within military museums in the contemporary and the decolonization of collections. Please welcome Staci-Marie Dehaney.
Hello?
Hi, we're hearing you.
Oh, okay. I've been
You can
having a
go
lot of
ahead.
technical difficulties this morning, so I wasn't sure.
We're
Okay,
hearing and seeing you fine. Great.
Oh, you're seeing me as well, because I can't see anything. All right, so today I'm going to speak about reconciling the past, military history, and imperialism. And I found, just as a note, I found Dr. Okenve's presentation really interesting and important. And I also noted some of the questions that highlighted speaking about Africa and the presence of Caribbean nationals in Africa. So I think my presentation would add some value to the discussion. Now, Dr. Roper, if you could just go to start presentation. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. All right. So the image we have up here, this is an image of the West India Regiment receiving medals at the completion of the Ashanti Wars in 1875. Now, the graphic reads, presentation of Ashanti medals to the 2nd West India Negro Regiment at Barbados, October 1875. And in the right-hand corner is the East and West Africa medal with the clasp, that's the little bar across the center there, saying Kumasi. Now I'll speak later on about Kumasi, but this image represents what was the height of imperialism, imperial expansion in Africa with essentially a Black regiment. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so here we have the drum major staff. Now, Sir General Templar spoke of, in speaking of regimental silver, he noted that these are treasures. They are part of the great tradition and martial pride, which is the heritage of those to whom we belong. We are all brought up to regard them as symbols of great achievement, of the glorious past. These silver tokens are the constant reminder of the loyalty and deep sense of duty of our forebears, and an incentive to all of us to try and do better. They are part of the great tradition. Now, the Military Museum and Library that's located at Up Park Camp in Kingston at the Jamaica Defense Force, well, between there and the Institute of Jamaica, because the Institute still holds some of their collection, they have about 300 regimental silvers. Now, these represent the legacies of the West India Regiment during British colonialism and the role they would have played in imperial expansionism in the 19th century. These regimental silvers display the battle honors on the regiments for important victories. So if you look at the bottom of this trophy, you will note some names such as Ashanti, Dominica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and these are what are called the battle honors. So the role that the regiment would have played in the success of a particular battle, they would be given the right to place those names on their colors, their flags, and their regimental silvers. It's a sense of an honor that is bestowed upon a regiment. So in this case, you have the Ashanti 1873, 1874, West Africa 1887, West Africa 1892 to 3, Sierra Leone 1898, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Dominica. Now, this particular trophy was the actual staff that was taken from a drum major in 1808. So the top of that trophy is a physical staff that was cut and placed to create a trophy here. And this was taken during the Napoleonic Wars in the Caribbean for the Battle of Marigalante in 1808. This was a time when the Napoleon had escaped from Elba, and the French governor declared him the emperor, and the British forces decided that they were going to invade Marigalante. And the drum major staff was taken as one of the prizes from that particular victory. Now, in creating this trophy from that particular object, the aim was to empower the soldiers of the West India Regiment, no doubt, to build their confidence and their pride as military men. Next slide, please. When we look at these regimental silvers, they are a small reflection of not only transference, but that of British imperial strategy during the period of expansion. So, through these exhibitions during British colonial administration, many objects reflecting the socio-economic and political life of other cultures also entered museums in faraway lands. The cartoon here shows the Ashanti Wars of 1874. Pictured is the British officer bearing a gift to the empire, which is normally represented as a female. And in the foreground, you can see the African soldiers, there's not African soldiers, but soldiers looking on, and you have kneeling the African chief to the right of the British officer. Now, this particular umbrella is actually held in the collection of the National Army Museum in London currently. Now, the Ashanti Wars were a combination of 5 conflicts between 1824 and 1901, which ended with the War of the Golden Stool. British interests in West Africa started with the importation of enslaved persons in the 17th century and later with the carving out of imperial protectorates. The military installations of the West India Regiment were established more predominantly for strategic internal defense and as an imperial instrument for overseas expectations in both the Caribbean and West Africa, while the British officers were elsewhere at other wars. Next slide, please. Now, V.S. Naipaul wrote that the colonial of whatever society is the product of revolution, and that revolution takes place in the mind. Imperial and colonial economic policies of the 19th century meant the establishment of a colonial economy that necessitated gain of sovereignty of taxes as well as foreign trade and currency. This was achieved through direct taxation of property, poll tax, and housing tax. Now, when V.S. Naipaul spoke of the colonial being created in the mind, he further highlighted that the contact between the colonizer and the colonized has seldom led to a complete breakdown of colonial cosmologies and ways of life, but always to its destructuring into fragments through challenging cultural values previously undertaken. Today, my presentation will look at the West India Regiment, a predominantly Black regiment that was raised to protect imperial interests within the Caribbean and Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. In recollecting military history to commemorate the fallen, the battles and achievements they encountered, creates a positive outlook towards the fallen. Through these commemorative representations in military museums, a positive and favorable interpretation of military history in Jamaica and the role the Army has played in social and political development is achieved. However, the question still remains, how could the reality of combat be represented in a museum's display? How could the desire in many military museums to commemorate be reconciled with the requirement of some visitors for more critical appraisal? These are the challenges of the military museums in the 21st century, as it seeks to remain relevant, acknowledge and commemorate, but also seek to reconcile the past for its visitors while representing the esprit de corps for the military servicemen and women, as most military museums are located and maintained by militaries. Now, through my presentation, I'll illustrate the role and importance of a Black regiment served in not only maintaining British interests in the colonies, but also as a strategic tool in creating the colonial state that was later established. And to explore further, using more recent displays, the ethnographic collections and discussions at the Military Museum, and how modern museums are dealing with the challenge of representing and reconciling difficult histories. Now, the slide we have here, creating a Black regiment. Now, Now, this quote here is a quote from 1794, basically justifying rationalizing the reason for having a Black regiment. It was deemed that Black soldiers would be more equipped to handle the climate and the terrain within the Caribbean and other new worlds to be as well, I guess Africa, than white soldiers, as in the case in Jamaica, as we know that the soldiers here died out in large numbers due to yellow fever and other illnesses. So the regiment was established in 1795, and up to 12 regiments would have been established over the period of their existence. As needs arose, they would raise a regiment, and when they no longer needed them, they would disband them. Ultimately, you had two predominant regiments, the first and the second, and they were disbanded in 1927. And during the period of the West India Regiment, they served in every war in West Africa in which the British was engaged. They were in the Ashanti Wars in Ghana in 1823 to 24 and the later campaigns. A recruiting station was even set up in Sierra Leone at Bunce Island for the purpose of enlisting people for the regiment in 1825. Now the question may be enlisting or forced. I cannot answer that definitively, but what I can say is that at the initial establishment of the regiment, most persons who came into the regiment were purchased by either slavers or from the plantations, but less from the plantations because the planters didn't want to have their enslaved Africans as part of this regiment, the idea of arming Blacks, which, as a side note, continued into World War I, the idea of arming Blacks and the creation of the British West Indies Regiment. Next slide, please. Now, the creation of a Black regiment created a Black elite within the colonies, and they were neither slaves nor free. Now, neither slave nor free, as I said before, that they were purchased by the army from slavers as well as from plantations initially. But in 1807, there was a mutiny law that was passed that declared that all who were within the army at that time were free. However, there's a small side note within all of that that basically said that they would serve until possibly, I guess, near death or to old age. So the question of whether or not they were free is one that is quite debatable. But one of the issues with it was with the creation of such an elite, it meant that within the remit of the barracks, they were quote unquote equals, but if they stepped out of the barracks, they would be viewed as enslaved persons within a slave society. Now, so they were treated equally within the barracks, but they were still subject to the civil law applicable to enslaved persons. They were therefore, when released from military duty, freed into a hostile environment. And that was the reason, rationale for the 1807 to kind of alleviate that ambiguity of what their status was, slave or not. Now, the creation of them as a regiment created a third class within society, as they considered themselves superior to those who were enslaved in bondage and equal to the white soldiers in every aspect of military service. They were treated in the same hospitals, wore the same uniform, and received the same pay, as well as in their indoctrination. They were taught that they were superior because they were serving the king in a military capacity. Now, this clearly was a tactic of divide and conquer, ensuring that though armed, many of the Blacks would not be sympathizers to the conditions of the enslaved. Further, that the recruitment effort of the British Army sought to acquire Blacks directly from Africa who would not have had any domestic relationship with the islands prior to military duty. They also sought for military duty chiefs and persons from the tribes that were considered more warlike, who would do better equipped at guerrilla warfare that was needed for both the Caribbean and further expansion and establishment of protectorates in Africa. Next slide, please. Now, with the discovery for gold and diamonds in Africa in the 19th century, European powers sought to establish formal territories. There was a growing interest in the establishment of colonies and to protect the newly formed borders from not only potential European invaders, but also from local chiefdoms. Next slide, please. The West India regiments, whilst in Africa, were engaged in battles with the Ashanti between 1823 and 1900. in the Ashanti Wars and in Sierra Leone in 1898. Largely, the battles between the British and the Ashanti were as a result of taxation being imposed on them, or the Ashanti's refusal to accept the taxation being imposed on them by the British. Now, the refusal of the British to honor the agreements between previous battles in which they were required to pay payments for the use of the castles for trade also contributed to the development of these different battles between the British and the Ashanti. Further, the refusal to accept and respect the cultural norms of the tribal community within which they engaged. The best example of this is perhaps the Ashanti Golden Stool. Now, the Ashanti Golden Stool, the governor of the Gold Coast, Frederick Hodgkinson, pronunciation probably bad, for him, he wanted the stool to be taken for him to sit on as a representative of Queen Victoria in the land. This started the Ashanti War of 1900s, also known as the War of the Golden Stool. Now, the Golden Stool was a symbolic object representing the soul of the nation and its people that exceeded its material existence and had a religious and cultural significance. I believe that in recognizing the significance of the stool, the governor knew that he would not have the full dominance of the people until he was able to capture and acculturate this symbol. And with that war, the Ashanti were able to secure and hide the stool from the British. Next slide, please. Now, in response, the Ashanti War 1873 at Kumasi, the initial,
I'm not sure what's going on with the PowerPoint, but I'm fixing it. Go ahead.
Okay. So the Ashanti War of 1873. Now, the first slide I showed showed the medal with the clasp that said Kumasi. Now, Kumasi was where the Ashanti attempted to block the British communication lines to the coast. Throughout the wars, the aim of the Ashanti War, was to reclaim their land and land's interests from rival tribes and to assert and maintain dominance in the region and expand the Ashanti Kingdom. Now, Captain C.B. Stewart was the officer in command of the British West India Regiment, who played a key role in the Ashanti War in 1873. You still need to go back some more.
It's not allowing me
Stewart
to
and
go
his...
back. It's not allowing me to go back, yeah.
Danny, exit the PowerPoint, then restart it.
Okay, all right, go ahead, Stacey.
Hold on a second.
So Stewart and his men maintained a fierce battle at Fomana as the British tried to...
We do have scales for each staffing pool, but it's not within the range that's been identified.
Break the communication lines of the British. The Ashanti were later defeated at Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti Federation. Now, the class Kumasi was awarded to Captain Stewart for the battle. Now, this medal, his particular medal, is held at the military museum. And a letter was written by the Major General commending the British regiment, in which he said, in saying goodbye, the Major General assures them he will always remember with pride and pleasure that he had the honor of commanding men whose loyalty to their queen and whose soldier-like qualities have been well proved in the war now happily at an end. The West India Regiment would then be allowed to have Ashanti, Sierra Leone, and other battles as part of their battle honors. I don't know if you're able to go to slide 10.
I'm trying to reopen it, but go ahead. As soon as I get it open, I'll start at 10.
Okay, so this particular slide, well, the image was a little important for this slide because this slide shows Chief Baibore. Now, Chief Baibore was opposed to British declaration of Sierra Leone as a protectorate over the interior in 1896, and a tax being levied on the houses of the native population, in addition to the British governor wanting to reduce the power of the African paramount chiefs by appointing white district commissioners. When the war broke out over these issues in 1898, Baibure led a coalition of fighters from several different kingdoms in a brilliant campaign that took the British entirely by surprise. When the British offered a reward for his capture, he responded offering twice for the capture of the governor. Using guerrilla tactics and warriors equipped with only muskets, swords, spears, and slings, he held the British forces at bay for several months. But when the British forces began burning the food supplies of the villages that were supporting him, he was forced to surrender. By then, he had won the admiration of his adversaries for both his fighting skills and his protection of civilians caught in the war zone, including British, American, and missionaries. So after he surrendered, the British accorded him great respect, taking him into custody, but allowing him some personal freedom during his captivity at Ascension Town in Freetown, and later in the Gold Coast, now present-day Ghana, where he was exiled for 7 years. The British would eventually bring him back to Sierra Leone and reinstate him as the chief of Casse, where he died and was buried 8 years later. Now, this image that's shown here on the screen of him sitting, it's part of a graphic from May 1898. At the height of the Hot Tax War, the British conscripted local troops from the West African Regiment, and then 4,000 troops from the West African Regiment, the Royal Artillery, Frontier Police, rank and file from the West India Regiment troops also participated with these operations. Now, the threat of internal security posed by the rebellion was serious, and the show of strength that the military operations represented was overwhelmingly decisive. A pattern had been set. For many years to come, the might of the distant monarch would be felt locally in the presence of troops, and African troops would take over orders directly from European officers. The policies that ensued changed the culture and socio-political landscape of Sierra Leone. The arrests provided British with the opportunity to ensure that only men they considered loyal were chiefs. Although no hierarchical order might previously had existed, the leaders were more important groups were styled paramount chiefs in areas less important, and in each area less important groups were to be headed by chiefs and sub-chiefs administratively subordinate to the paramount chiefs. So basically what they did was to shift the system of what would have existed, whether it was that the chiefs were selected by prominent families, or what the culture of the society was before. They changed that and made the decisions from the monarch to the European officers. Now, the drawing that's above was published in 1898, along with a dispatch from Freetown describing the petty chief Baibure and his followers had been roundly defeated by British troops, thus successfully ending the rebellion in the Protectorate of Sierra Leone. The British lieutenant in the West India Regiment, Henry Edward Green, made a pencil drawing of the great warrior depicting him sitting sideways on a wooden box, looking like an angry, despondent, shoeless old man with a rancor draped over him, his slumped shoulders. Now, next slide, please. Baibure of Tahini. Yes, that one. Baibure of Tahini, when a prisoner in Sierra Leone, 1898, original photograph by Lieutenant Arthur Greer, West India Regiment, who died in August 7, 1900, when storming a blockade after the relief of Kumasi in the Golden Stool War. That's the caption for this photograph. Now, until recently being 2013, thereabouts, the only image of Baibure made during his lifetime was a pencil sketch by Lieutenant Green, who died soon after. Now, we will still never know if Lieutenant Green's drawing is a true depiction of Baibure soon after he surrendered, or it was a way to make the point that British forces had not just defeated the great warrior, but also rendered him in a state of despair. In other words, we don't know if it was an accurate portrait or if it was that of a political propaganda. But what we do know definitively from this photograph here from Lieutenant Greer is of a different impression of the great warrior, who is clearly strong, healthy in this photograph, and has an attitude of confidence. He's being guarded by an armed soldier. We're not sure if this is from the West African Regiment or West India Regiment. Their uniforms were similar when they were in Africa. But he still has the appearance of a man in charge, a man long accustomed to issuing commands and having them carried out at once. There is no hint of despair in this version of him. Now, in 2013, the National Museum in Sierra Leone hosted an exhibition called The Face of Baibure. And this opened to the public, and it served the purpose to present a different view of the hero from the previously known, and would no doubt impact the perceptions of him and his fight against colonialism, because he's viewed as a hero there. Next slide, please. Like the National Museum of Sierra Leone, reclaiming history can be achieved through reimagining and representing of collections within military museums. In the next slide, in the Jamaica Military Museum and Library, I'm just going to go through a couple case studies of displays that I've seen where this reimagining of collections and military history is being done. So the Jamaica Military Museum achieved this with a temporary display as part of the commemorative activities surrounding the Heritage Week in 2018. The display formed part of a discussion of the West India Regiment in Africa, showing the research of then PhD student Melissa Bennett from Warwick University on imagery and the regiment during their campaigns in the Sierra Leone Hot Taps War in 1898. A discussion also followed exploring the challenge of the modern day military museum in presenting military history to reflect an inclusive representation that all visitors can relate to, and not just a celebratory montage of military conquest for the esprit de corps of the army. Now, this exhibit was partnered with the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica and the National Museums of Jamaica collection at the Institute of Jamaica. Next slide. Now, these ethnographic objects represent the social, political, and the economic life of the general era that the battles were engaged with the West India Regiment when they were in Africa. These particular objects shown here from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897, where they were plundered and plundered the Palace of the Ova and destroyed vast areas. Now, the bronzes represented here are not those taken from that period, but they are replicas of such. But as we know, there's a large debate, or has been a large debate ongoing, about the return of the Benin Bronzes that are held at the British Museum and other European museums. One of the things that a lot of what hasn't been done, or discussions surrounding these collections, is how they got into these museums. and the role of the military in the establishment of these collections is something that has not really been discussed. It's slowly being brought to the forefront in terms of the general discussion points of collections and the idea of decolonizing and representing the full histories of these ethnographic pieces, both in military museums and in ethnographic museums. Now, in giving the remarks for the exhibit, the curator noted that the display outside in the entrance area to the auditorium shows objects that from different sections of Africa, and they are placed within the same space as the regimental silvers that are often displayed at regimental dinners. The regimental silvers bear the battle honors for battles many know very little of, and silvers and commissioned for people we know even less about. October is Heritage Month, and it is viewed as a very fitting time to present our discussions of engagement within museums and how, as a military museum and library, the JMML can engage both military and civilians to examine history and to look at material culture differently. To view the regimental silvers that commemorative battles in not only a more complete manner, one that both represents the context of the battle and to provide a voice for the often voiceless people they fought, therein providing an avenue for further discourse and study into ethnographic collections, the stories they tell of colonization and the scramble for Africa and the impact it had. Today, we start a new conversation that can lead to new research on military history strategy, incorporating interdisciplinary work. Next slide, please. No, one more. Yes. So this image is from the exhibition at the National Army Museum, UK. This display is called Spoils of War. Now the caption reads, "Spoils of war can be culturally significant, and the use of objects where the information is known and the period and battle within which they were taken." Now, this particular object that's shown here, the years of the items read 1824, 1873, 1896, which were all the periods of the Ashanti Wars with the British. Such a large central basin in the large central basin that's shown in the photograph here was taken from the Royal Mausoleum in 1896. The caption points out the lack of background knowledge on the basin, but that it was linked to kingship, authority, and sacrifice. Now, the next slide shows other objects that would have been taken also from the same period of war between the British and the Ashanti. Next slide. Yes, and then you can go to the next one now. There are other related objects from the British campaigns currently held in other museums. Back one, please. Now, this is a gold amulet, right, that is located at the National Museum of Scotland. Now, last year, I think it's November last year, yes. November last year, the National Museum of Scotland opened the exhibit, Legacies of Empire. And the museum highlights that Legacies of Empire is about encounters and confrontations between nations and cultures in times of war. The objects featured were taken, purchased, or otherwise collected by British military and naval personnel during colonial wars or garrison service across the British Empire. Today, they are preserved in the National and Military Museum collections. The contentious military material legacy of the British Empire is presented in each object. Collections made during the period of European colonial expansion from the 18th to the 20th century are controversial and widely debated today. Using insights of military and imperial history, the exhibition investigates why these objects were collected and how they came into museums. Now that's as the beginning of how the engagement with these collections are going. But I would say that it needs to go much, well, I believe it will go much further to look at the full story, because this is how they came into the collections, what were the motivations for the collections, but there's so much more in terms of the full story of who the entire groups were. Because again, we know that the Ashanti Wars were not just European troops, but also West Indian troops who were initially taken from Africa to be a part of this regiment. What was the relationship like between the Black troops from the West India Regiment and the Africans in Africa that they fought? So there's a lot that can be done there, but in concluding, the next slide, the complexity of material culture, and particularly that of military history, provides an opportunity for reconciling silent histories, to give the full unfiltered stories of objects and their lives within communities. The regimental silvers of the Jamaica Defense Force have never been displayed anywhere other than within military spaces, and have remained as sites only to be viewed at regimental dinners or for visitors to the museum in what is essentially a trophy case. By constructing their histories with ethnographic objects, the dialogue of the dichotomy of the West Indian soldier and the enslaved society can be had. In this instance, a period of colonization, when a regiment of African descent was raised and utilized in battles that sought to further the imperial interests of European nations on the continent of Africa between the 19th and 20th centuries, using tactics that were to be for financial benefit of the empire, provides psychological warfare in societies whose structures and governance were heavily ingrained by their belief system. However, with the presence of West Indians in Sierra Leone from the 18th century, when the Trelawney Town Maroons were exiled there, the presence of West India Regiment soldiers, and the eventual settlement of some post-war speaks to the broadening of our understanding of a Caribbean diaspora, one that amongst other elements were contributed to by military campaigns such as the Sierra Leone Tax War. Incorporating ethnographic collections in military spaces as part of stories of militaries provide a space for the visitor to connect with the display and opens the floor for further dialogue. This also provides an avenue for the military personnel to also reflect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Staci-Marie. Thank you for bringing to our consciousness military history and imperialism and the need to reconcile both, and the value that they can add to our appreciation of the various functions and the various facets that our own cultures were impacted by.
We're not hearing Bernadette.
You weren't hearing me at all? Sorry about that. I was
Very,
just
very
saying thank you. Thank you, Staci-Marie, for that, for showing us how we can actually reconcile military history along with our own imperialism and how all the varying cultures were impacted by such. Thank you so much. So we had one comment where Marcia mentioned that she just read about the Ashanti Wars, and you've mentioned that as well, Stacey, with regards to the interactions that may or may not have occurred between the Black troops, the Black imperial troops, and those in Africa. Marcia is also asking if you mentioned the Victoria Cross won by Gordon.
Oh, well, I didn't mention the Victoria Cross as part of this discussion. No, I guess for the benefit of those who don't know, the Victoria Cross is the highest award that is given for an act of gallantry within the British forces. And to date, there have only been three now, one of Caribbean descent, who have been awarded the Victoria Cross, two from the West India Regiment, Sergeant William James Gordon, James William Gordon, keep mixing up the name, for a battle in the year is slipping me now, but it is in the 19th century, but it is during the period of expansionism that I did speak about with the Ashanti and the wars in Sierra Leone. And the other was from 1856, I believe, another West Indian soldier that was awarded that medal. Now, some of the issues surrounding the idea of the Victoria Cross and Gordon receiving the medal was that he received the medal for taking a bullet for his superior officer. So it was, I guess, an act of gallantry in the sense of loyalty, and that he received a bullet for his white officer and was awarded this medal. And whether or not today we should still commemorate his receiving that medal as part of our history, which the Jamaica Defense Force still does. So that is still a discussion and a debate within, I guess, military history of whether or not, or how do we deal with that part of our history. But personally, I don't believe that there is any aspect of our history that we should no longer speak about or just write off, because it is a part of our history. It is just a matter of how do we represent that information to tell the full story so that it can be viewed wholesome.
Thank you. I too agree with representing it because it is our history. We have another question again from Marcy. I'll just drop that in real quickly. Did the Jamaica militia send volunteers to the Boer War in South Africa?
Okay, so the Jamaica militia is separate from the West India Regiment. And the Boer War, to be honest, I don't know a lot about the Boer War. It actually is one of them that I'm planning to do more research on now. But the militia, if it is that the West Indian presence was sent, it would have been the West India Regiment and not the militia, because the militia was essentially for the protection of Jamaica itself. So in terms of just going through Jamaican military history, the Jamaica militia was first established from the 1660s when the British initially came to Jamaica. Now, one of the things that we probably don't realize when we look at the invasion of the British and the battle between them and the Spanish is that all the names that you hear have military ranks in front of them. And a lot of the early settlers in Jamaica were military men. So they, in establishing the initial settlement of Jamaica, also established protection mechanisms for their settlement. And that initial defense was the Jamaica militia. And as I said before, the West India Regiment was established for not just Caribbean interests, but also expansionism. And that came in 1795 following the American War of Independence. So it would have been the West India Regiment that would have been there, not the Jamaica militia.
Thank you. Another question, how should we reorient our understanding of military legacy and imperialism using silvers, especially to highlight the global reach, for want of a better word, of the West India Regiment, especially in the classroom?
Well, as I showed within one of the the examples I gave with the military museum, partnering with other entities to showcase not just the silvers, but the other side of the silvers. Who were the people? Who were the people that these battle honors were speaking of? And I recall from Dr. Okenve's presentation and his discussions about Africa and a focus being too much on slavery to some extent, of showing the relationship between the Caribbean and Africa after slavery. And I think that collective representing of history, just military, but general history, because essentially military history is a part of broader history. It's a part of social history, political history, economic history. Any battle, any decision that you can think of, there's oftentimes some amount of conflict that ensues before that is achieved. So I believe that this could be achieved. One of the things that the Military Museum has been doing in some years is to partner with the Heritage Trust and other entities to do lectures. And with those lectures, they do collaborative displays that speak to these issues, including during the commemorative period of the World War, that they spoke of the different monuments in the different parishes, and bringing a focus on understanding of the role that these men would have played within the war, the Caribbean effort within the war, and that focus of the particular monument that is there. So I think it's more than just the silvers, but it would also be nice to have the silvers go out on show. I mean, there's a lot of logistics where that is concerned, because the silvers are maintained within militaries with a lot of protocol. So the movement of the silvers may be something that's a little problematic, but I do believe that it can be achieved. And if it is the focus of the museum to want to present this to the wider society other than those who necessarily come into the museum space.
Thank you. Marcia has made another comment regarding the Victoria Cross for Gordon. That was earned in the medal earned in gallantry in combat. She's saying he deserved it. He was deserving of it. Well, we have no additional questions so far, Staci-Marie. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if Dr. Roper would like to make any comments at this time.
All right, everyone. So I just really are brief kind of vote of thanks. But first of all, I just want to say I'm extremely grateful for our presenters who were able to find time to join us in their, out of their schedules, to join us to share their work and kind of talk about just why it's so important. One of the things about the decolonizing of history is to kind of obviously disrupt narratives and identify the areas in which we need to have these conversations. And absolutely, I agree with both of my colleagues. One, in terms of restructuring how we engage Africa in the classroom and also in our kind of public space in Jamaica. But also, how do we use, and I think the military silvers really was an important case study to kind of think about how we can begin that process of redirecting our understanding of the Jamaican past to focus on things like the kind of the international component of the West India Regiment and their role in wars in Africa, which is something that generally speaking is not very well known. And so we're just really grateful that these scholars have taken time out to speak with us today. I want to extend a thank you to all our persons who joined us today, who stayed for the entire presentation. We're just really grateful, and I hope that during this very uncertain period of this public health crisis, that you're all safe and your families are well. And that you had a great Christmas season. I want to extend thank you to the members of the Jamaica Historical Society who were working behind the scenes to facilitate the presentations today. I want to thank my co-host, Mrs. Johnson, who of course also has taken time out to kind of facilitate this. So please, for those of you who are interested in joining the Jamaica Historical Society as we operate and function in this global space, please feel free to email us. I'm going to ask Mrs. Worrell to put the email back in the chat before y'all leave, so that feel free to email us so that you can join us. I mean, we are very much committed to sharing a diversity of the Jamaican historical experiences, relationship with the Caribbean and the world at large. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you face to face at some point in the future. So remember to social distance, sanitize, and more importantly, wear your mask. And thank you all for joining us today. And all the best for the rest of the day.